The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for letting us come before you. We thank you for your goodness and your love. We thank you for your sacrifice. We also thank you for giving us saints that we can look to learn from. I thank you for Therese of Liseux, her little way, and I pray that you would prepare our hearts to hear about her and also help us to live in a similar way, to love others in a sacrificial manner, to walk with confidence even in times of doubt, and to seek the good of others. I pray that you be with us tonight, guide our conversation and my words, and we pray that we would come to know you more through tonight and always. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. How many of you have heard of Saint Therese of Liseux? So a couple. Saint Therese of Liseux is a fun, relatable saint in the sense that she was not someone who did these great things that it's sort of hard to imagine ourselves attaining, but she was a young nun. She entered a convent when she was 15 in France, and during her life, she really sought to live in what she calls a little way. She recognized that she couldn't go out and do great things for God. She wasn't able to go out in the missionary field. She wasn't able to be a great teacher in the church. What she did try to do was to love in all these little things, that she wanted to do even small, ordinary things in an extraordinary way because it was done with the love of Christ. And so she learns about that throughout her life and then shares that in some of her writings. Most of my talk tonight is going to be based on this book, Story of the Soul, and there's also a study guide with this that had some very helpful discussion questions that I'm using for some of what I have in the handout tonight. It is broken up into 3 different manuscripts. So, as I said, Therese entered the convent when she was 15. She died very young. She died at 24 of tuberculosis. And before she died, her sisters, actual biological sisters who were also in the convent with her, 2 of them asked her to write a manuscript, one of her childhood, and that's manuscript A, and then one of her little doctrine, and that's manuscript B, and then the prioress of the convent asked her to go back and continue writing about her religious life, and that's manuscript C. So you'll see the breakdown in the handout with those 3 different sections. A little background first on Therese's family. And if you can go to the second slide when you get a chance, maybe he's not around to do that. But it's a little hard to see on the slide right now, but you do have on your handout, you have a sort of chart of the family. Louis and Zélie were married in 1858, and an interesting thing about them is they actually both had tried to enter religious life themselves, were refused, and ended up getting married. They lived about the first 2 years of their life as brother and sister, rather than as a married couple, and decided to change their mind and actually live as a married couple when a confessor, they went to confession and were convinced that they should actually start a family. And so they did. They had 9 children total, 4 of whom died at a very young age. 1 died about the age like 4 years old, and then 3 died as infants. Their other 5 daughters all ended up becoming nuns and entered convents. 4 of them were at Carmel, and 1 of them went to a different convent. So you can see, you can kind of keep them in mind on the top. Marie is the oldest sister. She was Sister Marie of the Sacred Heart when she entered the convent and became a nun. She is the one who asked Therese to write manuscript 2, or B. Pauline was a sister that she very much loved, and after her mother died when she was only like 4 years old, Pauline sort of became a second mother. Pauline entered the convent when Therese was still pretty young, became Mother Agnes of Jesus. During the time when Therese was there, she was a prioress, and so that's the time when she asked Therese to write manuscript A about her childhood memories. Léonie was at a different convent, and you'll see, I'll have some timelines on the handout. You'll see sometimes she enters convent, leaves, enters, leaves. She had a little bit more struggles in trying to find where she was going to land, and took the name Sister Francoise Therese, which is based on her sister. She entered a convent finally after Therese had passed away and took her sister's name. Celine was only 4 years older than her, and Therese writes often about how close she and Celine were. They were basically inseparable in her growing up years, and then she was very excited when Celine would be around in the convent. Although at that point Therese tried to separate her emotions from her sister so that she was not attached too much to her family. And then Therese, she took the name Sister Therese of the Child Jesus and Holy Face. So the first chapter is from birth until about 4 years old, that they are living in Alençon, and this is a very happy time in Therese's life. She was a very happy child, very affectionate, and her mother writes a story that is somewhat ridiculous, but it is about Therese and how affectionate she was at this young age, and also already getting these inklings of being religious, going to a convent possibly. So the story is that Therese would, in one breath, say, "I love you so much, dear Mom, I love you so much, I want you to die." And that's the next breath, and it's like, "Why would you say that?" And the mom sort of scolds her for it, and Therese says, "Well, you told me that to go to heaven, you have to die first, and I want you to go to heaven and experience that joy, so I want you to die." So it's just like these kind of ridiculous, extravagant showings of love that Therese experienced from a young age. She also heard about her older sister Pauline and how she was going to become what they called irreligious, so she would go into a convent, and although she didn't completely understand what that meant at that time, she was only about 2 years old when she thinks she'll be religious too, just like her older sister. On this first chapter, the quotation that I want to read is basically Therese responding to her superior, the prioress, who's also her actual sister Pauline, telling her to write her story of childhood. And she kind of resists a little bit. She's like, "What could I have to say that is useful?" But of course, out of obedience, I will do so. And then she also is sharing in this first quotation what you see throughout a lot of her writings is she loves flowers, and she loves the analogies that come with flowers and gardening. So she says, "I wondered for a long time why God has preferences, why all souls don't receive an equal amount of graces. I was surprised when I saw him shower his extraordinary favors on saints who had offended him, for instance, St. Paul and St. Augustine, and whom he forced, so to speak, to accept his graces. When reading the lives of the saints, I was puzzled at seeing how our Lord was pleased to caress certain ones from the cradle to the grave, allowing no obstacle in their way when coming to him, helping them with such favors that they were unable to soil the immaculate beauty of their baptismal robe. I wondered why poor savages died in great numbers without even having heard the name of God pronounced. Jesus deigned to teach me this mystery. He set before me the book of nature. I understood how all the flowers he has created are beautiful, how the splendor of the rose and the whiteness of the lily do not take away the perfume of the little violet or the delightful simplicity of the daisy. I understood that if all flowers wanted to be roses, nature would lose her springtime beauty, and the fields would no longer be decked out with little wild flowers. And so it is in the world of souls, Jesus' garden. He willed to create great souls comparable to lilies and roses, but he has created smaller ones, and these must be content to be daisies or violets, destined to give joy to God's glances when he looks down at his feet. Perfection consists in doing his will, and being what he wills us to be. It seems to me that if a little flower could speak, it would tell simply what God has done for it without trying to hide his blessings. It would not say, under the pretext of a false humility, it is not beautiful or without perfume, that the sun has taken away its splendor and the storm has broken its stem, when it knows this is all untrue. The flower about to tell her story rejoices at having to publish the totally gratuitous gifts of Jesus. She knows that nothing in herself was capable of attracting the divine glances, and his mercy alone brought about everything that is good in her. So you can see in here that she is processing the fact that she's about to tell her childhood, she's going to tell about her little way, and trying to recognize that she might not feel great or like she's done great things for God, except that she does have things to tell of God. And so I think that this is very relatable. We can say in our own lives, like, what great things have we done? But also we can be faithful in these small things that God has given us to do. I think at the end, I'd love to discuss some of the questions that I have in here. I don't think I'll stop now to discuss all of them. But with this first one, just think about this analogy of the garden, that sometimes we can only come to peace when we accept the place that God has called us to be. We might be driven in some situations to do an A+ job on projects in which we have overinvested our own egos, where we think that we're going to get a lot of recognition. But doing God's will might demand that we have the courage to do a C+ job, because God bids us to spend our time and energy on other tasks. Perfectionism can be unhealthy, and it can be an unhealthy striving, particularly when we are driven in areas where we have a fear of failure or the need of approval. And it's not the kind of perfection that God calls us to. And so reflect, are there some unrealistic, unhealthy goals that you are pursuing, and that's actually depriving you of happiness and peace? Is being driven in some area of your life preventing you from being the person that God wills you to be? The next chapter enters what Therese calls basically her second and the most painful part of her life. When she was only 4 years old, her mother passed away from a difficult breast cancer. And so she goes from being this very happy, affectionate child, outgoing, to being very timid, wanting to only be with family, and being much more sensitive. She was still growing during this time in her spiritual life. And so she talks about, before she really knew what it was to meditate, she was thinking, and it was really absorbed in what she calls real prayer. She says, I listened to distant sounds, the murmuring of the wind. At times, the indistinct notes of some military music reached me where I was, filling my heart with a sweet melancholy. Earth then seemed to be a place of exile, and I could only dream of heaven. And so it's sort of this realization that she's growing and she's wanting to think of God and praising Him for His creation, as He talks about in Romans, that we would know by His creation even that He is there. Her family at that time had moved from Alençon to Liseux, and they lived with an aunt and uncle and then those cousins as well. So this is why she is Saint Therese of Liseux. The next chapter she calls her distressing years. And I guess it's distressing after her mother has passed away. She also has distressing time during these years because it's the first time she goes to school and she finds that she doesn't really fit in with the other girls. She comments that she doesn't really know how to play with dolls even, and feels like she just doesn't fit in. She does well in school, but sometimes that gets the ire of all of her classmates. They might pick her on. They picked on her in some ways because of that. She also had a time of sickness during these years, and she writes about how nothing seemed to be helping her with that sickness, and she actually prayed and had a vision of the Virgin Mary, and she was better from that time on. It was also during this time that Pauline left the convent, and she didn't really understand what Carmel was at that point and where Pauline was going, except she knew it was to be a-religious, to be a nun. And so she was very sad about that. She writes that she did not yet understand the joy of sacrifice. And so her sister explained the convent, and when she heard all about what happened there, she thought it was very beautiful, and she felt a call to enter that convent herself. When Pauline enters, she takes the opportunity to try and talk to the prioress and convince her that she should enter already herself. And the prioress says, no, you're 9 years old, you don't need to enter the convent yet. You have to at least be 16, and a lot of people were older than that when they entered. So she's heartbroken about Pauline leaving, and felt like she was losing her second mom. On the next chapter, her first communion, she talks about first communion, her boarding school, and during this time period, especially with her first communion, it's really fun to read about how much joy she experiences. I forgot to mention on the previous chapters, she had seen her older sisters go through this preparation period for their first communion. And when her older sister Celine, who like I said is 4 years older than her, had her first communion, Therese described it as like one of the happiest days of her life. And she had seen her older sister Pauline teach Celine for months before that time about what it was that she was about to receive and the weight of it. And Therese tried to sneak in and hear the same lessons, and Pauline would tell her, no, it's not time for you to learn yet. And she writes, I don't think that 4 years is too long to prepare in order to receive Christ. So she takes it very seriously even from a very young age. But then she's looking forward all these 4 years and more to her first communion. And so then when she actually gets to her first communion, she is basically just ecstatic. And the way she writes about it is very sweet. So she says, how sweet was that first kiss of Jesus. It was a kiss of love. I felt that I was loved. And I said, I love you, and I give myself to you forever. There were no demands made, no struggles, no sacrifices. For a long time now, Jesus and poor little Therese looked at and understood each other. That day, it was no longer simply a look. It was a fusion. They were no longer two. Therese had vanished as a drop of water is lost in the immensity of the ocean. Jesus alone remained. He was the master, the king. Her joy was too great, too deep for her to contain, and tears of consolation soon flowed. All the joy of heaven having entered my heart, this exiled heart was unable to bear it without shedding tears. And so you can see these times where she has this overwhelming emotion and love for God. And she experiences it with her first communion and is so excited on subsequent times when she gets to receive communion again. She also writes during this season, I think we're on page 3 of the handout, this story basically of recognizing that God has saved her from great sin, but that makes her love God all the more. So she says, I know that without him, I could have fallen as low as St. Mary Magdalene, and the profound words of our Lord to Simon resound with a great sweetness in my soul. I know that he to whom less is forgiven loves less, but I also know that Jesus has forgiven me more than St. Mary Magdalene, since he forgave me in advance by preventing me from falling. I wish I could explain what I feel. Here is an example which will express my thoughts at least a little. Suppose a clever physician's child meets with a stone in his path, which causes him to fall and breaks a limb. His father comes to him immediately, picks him up lovingly, takes care of this hurt, using all the resources of his profession for this. His child, completely cured, shows his gratitude. This child is in no doubt right in loving his father. But I'm going to make another comparison. The father, knowing there is a stone in his child's way, hastens ahead of him and removes it, but without anyone seeing him do it. Certainly this child, the object of the father's tender foresight, but unaware of the misfortune from which he was delivered by him, will not thank him and will love him less than if he had been cured by him. But if he should come to learn the danger from which he escaped, will he not love his father more? Well, I am this child, the object of the foreseen love of the Father, who has not sent his word to save the just, but sinners. He wants me to love him because he has forgiven me, not much, but all. He has not expected me to love him much like Mary Magdalene, but he has willed that I know how he has loved me with a love of unspeakable foresight, in order that now I may love him unto folly. I have heard it said that one cannot meet a pure soul who loves more than a repentant soul. How I would wish to give the lie to this statement. I really appreciated this section from Therese's writings, in part because I think that we can look on stories of people who have hit what we might say is like a rock bottom and then come around, and these great conversion stories. And I also think of what she said with Simon, like he to whom less is forgiven loves less, but he's been forgiven much, loves more. And recognizing how much God has done in our lives, whether it's like these great stories that we can tell, I was here, now I'm over here, or God actually kept me from this terrible path in the first place, and having the benefits of what he's protected us from, and how that can lead us to great love as well. And so recognizing there, but the grace of God go I in a deep way. The next chapter is after the grace of Christmas, and Therese writes here about another conversion for her. and I won't read this whole next section, but she talks about how she was really unbearable because of her extreme touchiness. She would cry all the time. Anytime she offended someone or felt like she had done anything, even small thing wrong, she wanted to make sure that everyone knew about it, and basically wouldn't stop until she could confess it, but then also would cry about it. She would cry about crying about it. It was like she was uncontrollable. And she worked on this. This is basically from the time she was 4 years old until this time at this Christmas. She was trying to work on these issues in her life. She knew that it was too much, that she was this touchy and this emotional, that she couldn't control her emotions. And so on this Christmas, there is a tradition in France, apparently, and I was not familiar with it, but the youngest child would put their shoes out, and then the family would fill it with gifts. And so she, as the youngest child, put her shoes out when they got home from church and was expecting gifts, and I guess walked away. She overheard a conversation between her father and her sister Celine, and her father is kind of annoyed, aren't we a little too old for this? Well, I suppose this will be the last time. Celine hears this and also sees that Therese was within earshot, and she says, Therese is going to be a mess after this. Can we try not to say things like this where she could hear it? And so then she goes to talk to Therese, and Therese is holding back tears, but basically recognizes a conversion, what she calls a conversion, that she is able to control that emotion a little bit more, and also recognize that there is beauty in being others-minded. So she has a conversion where she feels a deep desire to work for the conversion of sinners and to think of others more than herself. And she's able, not necessarily to not be emotional after that, but to control that emotion a little bit more. One example of how she was, at that point, praying for the conversion of sinners. So shortly after this, she hears a story about I think it was somebody who had murdered, is somebody who had been convicted of murder. He was basically on death row, was convicted to the death penalty, and she hears about it and is thinking that I want to pray for this man. I don't want him to go to his death not knowing the Lord and not being converted to turn from his sins. And so she's praying and begging God that he would give her a sign that this man is actually converted. And she receives that sign. This man, Pranzini, had not gone to confession before he died, but he was mounted on the scaffold and was preparing to place his head into the formidable opening, when suddenly, seized by an inspiration, he turned, took a hold of the crucifix that the priest was holding out to him, kissed the sacred wounds 3 times, and then was executed. And she responded to that, one, because of the sign that it felt like this man had actually converted, and were her prayers effective in helping God work in that, but also when she had this conversion in her own life, she had really responded to the wounds of Christ. She had cried over the fact that she saw Jesus on the cross with the wounds and thinking about the blood that he spilled. And so she was also really moved by his wounds. And so it was powerful to her that this man was kissing the sacred wounds of Jesus in sort of the same way and responding to the suffering of Christ. The reflection question for you to think about with this chapter is about the times God has transformed you in your life. And I, again, go back to the fact that not all of us have the St. Paul conversion stories. But what ways has God worked in the smaller ways that is still very powerful, and recognizing and being thankful to God for his power in changing our character defects, our smaller faults that maybe others would say, oh, that's no big deal, except that we know maybe we've worked on them ourselves and we're not actually effective at changing it. And also that he can use some of our efforts as a component of our growth and transformation. At the end of that chapter, she decides that she is ready to enter the convent, and she asks her father for permission to enter the convent. He tells she gives this story of her father agreeing that she could enter the convent at a young age. I think she's only 14 when she actually asks. And as I said, she loves flowers, and her father had walked over to this wall covered in moss that had small little white flowers, and he pulled one out and gave it to her. And she saw that the roots were still attached. And so it felt like her dad was basically giving her permission that you are this little flower, and you can be transplanted someplace else where you can also grow. And so I don't know if that is from that point that she loves referring to herself as a little flower, but it was definitely a powerful image for her when her dad did not say a lot, but was agreeing that she could enter even when it would hurt him, that she would enter at such a young age. So then she finds out from the convent that they are not willing to let her enter, but she can talk to the bishop and see if he will change their mind. She goes to the bishop, asks for his approval, and he thinks that he's doing the dad a service by saying, you should stay at home for several more years, you should wait until you're 21 to enter. And the dad basically says, this is the Lord's will. Like, I accept that she should go to the convent and approve her going. So the end of that chapter, I guess, ends with an open question. Is she going to be able to get into the convent or not? Is the bishop going to relent or not? And the father recognizes that Therese wants to do everything in her power to try to enter the convent at this age. So the next chapter, they go to Rome and try to see the Pope. And they are successful. She is, I suppose, probably like a long line with lots of people. She finds out that, you're not supposed to say anything to the Pope when you get to him. Just kneel down for a blessing, move on. And she's with her sister Celine, who's like, I plan to come say these things, what should I do? And her sister's like, you should still say the things. So she gets to the Pope and tries to ask him for permission. She knows that if the Pope says she can go to the convent, then everyone's going to say she can go to the convent. Let's see. So she asks, Holy Father, in honor of your Jubilee, permit me to enter the Carmel at the age of 15. And she's a little nervous, probably a language barrier. The Pope says, I don't understand very well. The bishop that she had talked to happens to be right next to the Pope and says, Most Holy Father, this is a child who wants to enter Carmel at the age of 15, but the superiors are considering the matter at the moment. So the Pope says, well, my child, do what the superiors tell you. And Therese responds, oh, Holy Father, if you say yes, everybody will agree. And he said, go, go, you will enter if God wills it. So he doesn't actually say yes. He says, listen to what the superiors say. And so she's a little disappointed with how this goes. She thinks she's done everything that she can, but she's not really sure what's going to happen and if she's going to be able to get in. During this trip, this is basically a pilgrimage for the people to go to Rome, and so there's lots of different places that they stop along the way. But one of the things that she talks about is how during this time, she was a little, I guess before, right, I talked about how she was praying for great sinners. She thought that she was wanting to convert those who had nothing to do with God and didn't know him. And on this trip, she starts to see a different vocation, or at least maybe add to that vocation, that she would also pray for priests and the work that they are doing. One is that she recognizes that although it seems that they are saintly priests, they are still very much fallible human beings who have different issues. And she writes, if the salt loses its savor, wherewith will it be salted, right? And so she wants to pray for the priests, that they would be preserved in their saltiness. And this is actually part of Carmel's vocation, that they are all to be praying for other religious people, other priests. And she identifies more with the mission of that particular convent. She hears back, finally, that she's allowed to enter Carmel, and she has to wait until after Lent, and so she has to wait several more months, but she eventually does get to enter the convent. And that's chapter 7, where she gets to enter. Shortly after her entrance, though, her family experiences a lot of trials. Her father has a stroke and then basically has some mental issues where he disappears for a while, has to go into a mental institution, relapses with different health concerns. And there's these rumors going around basically that Therese and her sisters are driving him crazy, that he's so sad over the loss of his daughters who are all going to the convent that he is not truly sane. And these are rumors that are spreading, and she is having to deal with them at the convent. She hears them. And so she is enduring the suffering, one, because she has to know that somebody she loves is suffering greatly and going through something that she can't really help with. She's suffering because of the rumors and what is the truth of them, and that enters into doubts. Has she done the right thing? Everyone seems to be telling her, actually, you should wait until you're older. Should she have waited until she was older? But she feels convinced that she is where she's supposed to be, and so continues at the convent. But it's a difficult time as she sees everything that her father is going through. There's a point in this chapter where she receives her habit, which I think is when she takes the name and becomes more like a parishioner. I don't really understand how all of that works. But she tells this great story too, and this is still a time where she has this great love for Jesus that she feels is he reciprocates in a way that gives her sort of the comfort of that love. And so on the day of her entrance, she wanted snow because she wanted everything to be white like she was. I think she wore white, sort of this image of getting married and the pure bride marrying the bridegroom. And she wanted everything else to be white as well. So she wanted snow, and she knew it was sort of a silly request. But it snowed on the day that this happened. So one of those things where she felt like Jesus was just giving her such a sweet little gift. The next chapter, chapter 8, is her profession and offering the merciful love. And I have two different quotes on this one. I won't read the first one. During this time, she attended a cousin's wedding, and this is right after, shortly after she had just done her own wedding of sorts. And she read her cousin's wedding invitation and then decided that she would write her own little wedding invitation. And I think that this is a really fun thing for you to read through later. I think especially at the end, she talks about, when will this celebration be? It's coming. It's going to be, it'll take place tomorrow, the day of eternity, on which Jesus, Son of God, will come on the clouds of heaven in the splendor of his majesty to judge the living and the dead. The hour being as yet uncertain, you are invited to hold yourselves in readiness and to watch. I think it's a fun sort of outpouring and creativeness of her love and the love that God is giving her. While she is in Carmel, she has more times of doubting, and she talks about that in her writings, that there are more times where even before she, I think, makes the profession of what her vocation will be, she has some doubts, and she's sort of thinking to herself, I don't know if I should say anything about these. What if I tell my superiors and they say, well, actually, you shouldn't be here at all, you should stop all that you're doing. She gets nervous about things like that, but she ends up basically confessing her doubts and finding that the doubts go away. And also that some of her superiors can relate, that they say, I had similar doubts, continue on what you're doing the right thing. And she felt like that even drove the devil away, that some of these doubts were things that he was casting on her at that time. But there were different seasons where she felt less of that outpouring of love in the convent. She writes about this time right before a retreat. She didn't really like retreats. Oftentimes she felt like they were just, they were difficult for her. And part of the reason some of that was difficult was the time there were some teachings called Jansenism, and this was a teaching basically that you should always do the harder thing. Harder equals holier. You don't really need to live with joy or love. it was a very harsh, and it had a very harsh view of God. And so some of the retreats also were teaching her some of those things, and it was hard for her to hear some of that. And she felt like this was going to be another retreat where it was just going to cast her into periods of having. I think she was afraid of getting what she called scruples. I had not heard that term before, but earlier in her life, she had this like 1.5 year period of scruples where she basically felt like, in the same time period that she was very sensitive, she had to confess everything right away, and even then it wasn't potentially going to be good enough. There was always this fear that you would get forgiven if like you were already forgiven, and there was really nothing you could do to know or have confidence or feel that God was actually good. And so I think she was nervous about falling back into this time of scruples. She talks, though, about this father who was coming to teach at the retreat. She's already nervous about the retreat. She's also nervous because he wasn't usually teaching religious people. He was usually teaching people out in the community. So she's also thinking, he has nothing to teach us. Like, I will do my best to listen and learn. But she was feeling like she wasn't going to learn anything. She gets to the confessional, and she actually feels her soul expand, she writes. After speaking only a few words, I was understood in a marvelous way, and my soul was like a book in which the priest read better than I did myself. He launched me full sail upon the waves of confidence and love which so strongly attracted me, but upon which I dared not advance. He told me that my faults caused God no pain, and that holding as he did God's place, he was telling me in his name that God was very much pleased with me. The reflection question is, has God ever used an unlikely person to minister to you? Has a chance encounter or parenthetical remark proved to be the means by which God's providence changed your life? And I guess a very brief aside, I related to this one particularly because I remember one time being really down and not expecting the person I was talking with to have any idea what I was talking about. He said immediately, "Is it this thing that you're worried about?" And when you don't expect somebody to know, it's quite surprising and a relief. It feels like God is speaking directly to you through this person. That is the end of manuscript A. So those are her childhood memories that she writes as the first one to her sister. Manuscript B is just 1 chapter long. It's My Vocation is Love. And this is a good, if you only wanted one thing to read after this, this is her trying to summarize what is her little way. It is also, I think, very focused on how her little way is centered and grounded in love. So she writes, I guess before I read some of this section, she writes about how she wants to be a warrior for God. She wants to be a priest, an apostle, a doctor, a martyr. She wants to do great things for God. And she reads some of the stories in the Bible, and she reads about some of the things from St. Paul, and she thinks, where do I fit into this? And she says, I finally had rest. Considering the mystical body of the church, I had not recognized myself in any of the members described by St. Paul, or rather I desired to see myself in them all. Charity gave me the key to my vocation. I understood that if the church had a body composed of different members, the most necessary and most noble of all could not be lacking to it. And so I understood that the church had a heart, and that this heart was burning with love. I understood it was love alone that made the church's members act, that if love ever became extinct, apostles would not preach the gospel, and martyrs would not shed the blood. I understood love comprised all vocations, that love was everything, that it embraced all times and places, in a word, that it was eternal. Then, in the excess of my delirious joy, I cried out, "Oh Jesus, my love, my vocation, at last I have found it. My vocation is love." So she's talking in here about the body of Christ, that she recognizes that if she can be part of the body of Christ, she's part of these great acts, and especially when she does her own things through love, she's joining in the love of Christ. She goes on, and I won't read this next section, but she goes on to describe basically being a child in the king's court. What great things is a child in the king's court going to do? maybe nothing great. Those things are reserved for the brothers who will often fight the wars. But she can love the king and queen, and the king and queen can love her. And she can strew her flowers, and they can enjoy her flowers. So it's these small things that she can do that might charm or bring a smile to the king's face. And so she kind of uses, again, that imagery of the flower and what she's going to do with the flowers in her little way to love others. She wrote, too, that Jesus does not demand great actions from us, but simply surrender and gratitude. He has no need of our works, but only of our love. And so the reflection question talks about how what makes a deed extraordinary is not the deed itself, but the love that is contained in the deed. And we can hear this, too, in the writings of Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. You can do all these great things, but if we don't have love, it's a clanging cymbal. It's nothing that's actually all that good. So you can think through, what are the ways that you can strew flowers in your daily acts of charity? Can you see them as pleasing the King, the Father? And then also, how do you see what you do at home and work? Do you see your duties as simply tasks to be done, or do you recognize the ways that God might call you to the holiness of love? What things might help you sustain a faith vision of eternal significance when you do the mundane? Next, we'll start Manuscript C, and this is 2 chapters. This is very near the end of her life. Therese has already gotten very sick with tuberculosis. Unfortunately, the doctor at the convent did not think that she had tuberculosis and that what she had was serious, so actually for quite a while she was continuing her normal duties, which include teaching some of the other novices, and I'm not sure what else it involved, but for a while she would continue on. And part of the reason why the doctors did not identify, and her sisters at the convent did not always identify that she was very, very sick, is because she continued to do things with so much cheer and joy. And I don't know that it was actively trying to hide, but it was definitely not complaining and not trying to make her suffering known. She was trying to continue to love others and think of others more than herself. This section, she writes about a couple different stories, and I think that this is where I had initially heard of Therese, is this way that she loved others even when they kind of bothered her, or she was annoyed by them, that she went out of her way to try and love them. And this was one of the things that marks her little way. So there is in the community a sister who has the faculty of displeasing me in everything. In her ways, her words, her character, everything seems very disagreeable to me. And still, she is a holy religious who must be very pleasing to God. Not wishing to give in to the natural antipathy I was experiencing, I told myself that charity must not consist in feelings, but in works. Then I set myself to doing for this sister what I would do for the person I loved the most. Each time I met her, I prayed to God for her, offering him all her virtues and merits. I felt this was pleasing to Jesus, for there is no artist who doesn't love to receive praise for his works. And Jesus, the artist of souls, is happy when we don't stop at the exterior, but penetrating into the inner sanctuary where he chooses to dwell, we admire its beauty. I wasn't content simply with praying very much for this sister who gave me so many struggles, but I took care to render her all the services possible. And when I was tempted to answer her back in a disagreeable manner, I was content with giving her my most friendly smile, and with changing the subject of the conversation, for the imitation says, it is better to leave each one in his own opinion than to enter into arguments. Frequently, when I was at recreation, I mean during the work periods, and had occasion to work with the sister, I used to run away like a deserter whenever my struggles became too violent. As she was absolutely unaware of my feelings for her, never did she suspect the motives for my conduct, and she remained convinced that her character was very pleasing to me. One day at recreation, she asked in almost these words, "Would you tell me, Sister Therese of the Child Jesus, what attracts you so much toward me? Every time you look at me, I see you smile." Ah, what attracted me was Jesus hidden in the depths of her soul, Jesus who makes sweet what is most bitter. I answered that I was smiling because I was happy to see her. It is understood that I did not add this was from a spiritual standpoint. It's remarkable, after Therese publishes, well, she writes these stories, her sisters work at publishing the book. Years go by, and the sister that she is talking about didn't know that Therese was talking about her. She did find out at the very end of her own life. But right here in the middle of her life, and even for years on, she had no idea that Therese was kind of bothered by her and annoyed. And Therese is going out of her way, not just to pray for her, but to do nice things to her and smile at her and basically act like she is a better friend than what she feels. And so she knows that there is, sometimes we have to act on unfelt love, that we choose the good of the other, and choose to love even when we don't feel like it and we don't really want to be around this person. There might be people in your own life where you're feeling like it's difficult to love. You're not attracted to them and they just bother you. And so in what ways can you choose to love these people that God has placed in your path and put in your care? The last chapter is those whom you have given me. Some of this chapter, Therese talks about how she was teaching novices. She didn't actually love teaching the novices. She was doing this out of obedience as one of the things she was supposed to do. She didn't want to tell people what was wrong, but she also knew that this was something that she was called to do, and so she took it so seriously that she recognized sometimes they're not going to like me for this, but I have to say the truth. And she does that, and she also prays about the right time to do it. She's making sure that she's communicating with God, trying to think through, like, how is this person going to receive this thing, and then tries to tenderly reprove people and correct them. Other times, she talks about how she saw other sisters who are not novices doing something that she didn't really like, and she thought, it's actually not my job to correct those sisters. And so there were times that she held her tongue and did not do anything towards those sisters, but tried to give them grace to say maybe they are better intentions, or coming from a better place than what I might see and think myself. This is not a question on here, but one of the things that the study guide talks about and that I thought was helpful is who are the people in your life that maybe God is calling you to speak truth to, even though it's difficult, and who are the people that maybe even if you want to correct, God is not calling you to that specific thing, and you might try and take what they are doing with more grace and understanding. Also in the last chapter, Therese talks briefly, but also in the epilogue of the whole book, I learned she went through over a year of this like dark night of the soul, essentially. She had doubts. She didn't know if, I guess the thing that she was feeling is that she knew she wanted to love God and she wanted to love others, but she didn't always feel that love. And unlike earlier in her life, where she felt this great outpouring, sometimes she felt like she had these great gifts from God, during most of the end of her life, she did not feel those things, and yet she continued on her little way. She continued to love almost sacrificially in these very small things. And so one small thing she wrote is, sometimes when my mind is in such a great aridity that it is impossible to draw forth one single thought to unite me with God, I very slowly recite in Our Father, and then the angelic salutation. Then these prayers give me great delight. They nourish my soul much more than if I recited them precipitately 100 times. And I just wanted to raise this, this time in her life when it's so difficult to continue to love God, where there's doubts and frustrations. And she talks about how this is a great time almost to prove the love. That, it's easy to love when it's, comes naturally and flows from us, and we have this outpouring of emotion to love. But what about the times when we don't feel that way? The emotions don't follow, and yet we can continue to love during those seasons. And also it is encouraging, I think, when we have doubts, when we have these difficulties, to know that somebody who is living so faithfully had these doubts and continue to struggle with them. She confessed them, she tried to work through them, but she continued to love and live out her little way. In 1897, in September, Therese died of tuberculosis. And shortly after that, her sisters worked on the manuscript and published it, and since then, there have been a couple different editions. This particular one is focused on trying to maintain however it was that Therese was writing. She was writing when she was sick, so sometimes her thoughts are kind of scattered. There are some footnotes that give background into her life. But it's just remarkable to hear, even at the end of her life, she doesn't really complain. She isn't talking about the things that are difficult. She mentions them a little bit, but she even says, I'm trying not to dwell on those things. And she's given an example of how in small, ordinary, mundane things, we can live faithfully and in love. Are there any questions?
Was she I assume she's Roman Catholic?
Yes.
She's Roman Catholic saint.
She is Roman Catholic.
And only not Anglican too.
I did not actually look up on the list to see how much the Anglicans reference her.
So what was she credited with miracles? Don't they have to be officially a saint? That's where it mentioned. What was her miracle?
Right, the question is, what were her miracles as Roman Catholics? After somebody dies, they would need to be attributed to certain miracles that happened after their death to say that they are actually canonized as saints. And unfortunately, I don't actually know that. It was shortly after she died that she became canonized, and she writes about certain things before she dies that she intends to do. Of course, I don't know how that works, but she prayed for some brothers who were missionaries. She talked to people about the flowers that she would leave behind. Like, save these. I want to continue this work of mercy after I die. But I don't actually know what the miracles are that she's attributed with doing after she died.
I don't have a question, but I got 3 observations. The first is, although I didn't recognize St. Therese as Sue, I do recognize the little flower. I've heard the little flower since I was a child. So I think she, for whatever reason, she's doing better for the little flower than her actual name. The second thing is, these things that she wrote that are quoted here are remarkable for somebody that age. And some of the stuff she wrote when she was, elementary school age. And it's got to be inspired, by God, because a typical person at this age without being able to like this kind of material. And the last thing that struck me was at the end of her life when she was having the faith down, it sounded almost exactly like what St. Therese of Calcutta reflected not that many years ago. That as she was struggling with all the stuff that she was doing, she had faith down as well. Sounded just like that.
I had that question, the same question about when was this written, because the quotation on the first page, was she 4 years old? And so was this written in retrospect later as she reflected and did her manuscript and was writing it, how she felt at that age?
The question is when she actually wrote this, and it was something that she wrote later. So she's already in the convent when she wrote this. I want to say it's like 1896. Okay, so I have in here the notes on page 7. 1896 is when she wrote manuscript B, and 1895 is when she wrote manuscript A. So this is...
So it's not writing of a child.
Even so, it's still remarkable for somebody who had it. Right?
Did you ever read any of Julia's papers?
Sure. Yeah, before she turned them into it.
What's remarkable to me, I think, especially as she grows older, she's a teenager when she first has these fervent religious experiences. And like you fall in love with your husband when you're young, a whole bunch of that emotionalism, as you grow and as you mature, even though she was 20 4 when she was still an adult then. And I think as you grow, pretty soon you realize that one of my favorite quotes is from a book called To Love Is God Loves, and it goes exactly with what you're saying. And it's Roberta Bondi, and she writes, love is a long-term and cultivated commitment of the heart that has less to do with how you feel and everything to do with how you act.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is reflected in her later on.
Yes, very much. I don't know that I'll end with I sort of wondered if I would have a discussion question that we could do with these reflection questions. But I guess I was very much encouraged with reading her story and some of those discussion questions I thought were very helpful to think through my own life, the ways that God has been working, even in very small ways, the ways that He has prevented me from great sin, the ways that we can love Him because we see all of He has done in our life, the ways we can do ordinary, mundane things with great love. So I hope this might be something you can take and continue to read on her and reflect on those questions. So I'll go ahead and end in prayer.
Would you, I'm wondering, she died so young. It seems to me that her writings that she left are what got attention after her death. But she did not have, she didn't seem like a very nice person. So I don't think she got a lot of attention while she was alive. She was doing things and writing about things that she didn't. She was out of duty, I would say. I'm wondering. She talks about not having the feelings of love. But in writing about it, probably got attention.
So I think the question is mainly like she became more known after she died because of her writings, rather than something that she was known during her lifetime. And I think that is true. That she refers to herself as little flower, this little way. She's not known in the side of the world. And also, even before her death, her assistants in the convent are kind of wondering, what are we going to say about her in her obituary? Like, we know she's about to die. We're not quite sure what to say about her. And so the last manuscript, I think, was in part to get a little bit more information that they might be able to write about her. And it was something then that was published, and it did make her much more known. That we would probably never have heard about her had she not been writing these things.
Maybe one more thing.
Sure.
Page 8 of your under the reflection. It's very bottom. How do you see what you do, both at home and at work? Do you see your duty, teaching housework, etc., what has to be done, or as the context in which I apology to the holiness of love? And I hope people who are here for the first time on George Herbert remembers one of his poems called The Alexa, which is now in our hymnal. Teach me, O God and King, in all things lead to see that what I do for anything, I give all to thee. And it's, this idea right here. It's really fun to see if you can find a connection in all these classes that we've had. What did the saints have in common? Even though they're from different countries and different ages.
All right, we will close in prayer. Lord, we thank you so much for your love. We thank you for the ways you poured it out abundantly and extravagantly on us. We thank you for the sacrifice on the cross and the power of your resurrection. We thank you for the story of the soul for St. Therese and Liseux, and We pray that we would take some of these little ways to live faithfully to you, to love others with your love, to be a part of the body of Christ by doing all things in the love that you have for us. That we would choose to love and to choose to will the good of the other, even when there are doubts, even when there is not the feelings that come with it. Help us to be faithful in our home and at work, with all things. We pray that you would guide us today and every day. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Amen. Oh.